Hello, assalamu alaikum, namaste, sat sri akal. My name is Farheen Khan and you're watching the AZEEZA show. Just wanted to welcome you to the show this week. Last 2 weeks we've had some really great discussions about accessibility, particularly in the month of December. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about something else that's very close to home, and that's food insecurity. So with me are my guests Rena Reddy and Nikki McAllister. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So I want to jump right into it. So, let's start talking. Can you please tell the audience who you are, what you do, and then we'll take it from there.
My name is Rena Reddy, and I work at Daily Bread Food Bank. We work with agencies, which are basically food banks and meal programs. Some people know them as soup kitchens. And we distribute food across Toronto, and we support those agencies in providing dignified and respectful service to get free food across Toronto to those who need it, mostly people living in poverty. I also do some community organizing outside of my job. So I try to be involved in anti-racist movements in Toronto and support those communities and a few other things. So I'm trying to keep busy. And I guess in terms of who I am an immigrant. I was born in Dubai and came here when I was about 9. I grew up in Mississauga, so I'm at home right now. And I live in Toronto, and I'm genderqueer, so I'm part of the trans community. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get into that.
Cool. That's great. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
My name is Nikki McAllister. With Daily Bread, I'm a community engagement coordinator. With our agency relations department, we sort of divide the city up, and each coordinator takes care of and provides support to the member agencies that are in that area. So my area is Etobicoke, North Toronto, and a little piece of York. For the most part, I provide support to our member agencies with regards to how to provide service to those who are accessing our food programs. If I can, or if we're able to, open new food programs in those areas. Do some training. I provide CPI training at Daily Bread for our member agencies.
And that's crisis intervention for
Exactly, right. Yes. Nonviolent crisis prevention and intervention training. And I also attend meetings to help support some of the issues that our communities are facing, those that are accessing our programs. So right now I'm part of the Lakeshore Affordable Housing Advocacy and Action Group. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do. Awesome. And I'm a single mom, and I have a 10-year-old daughter, and she takes up all the rest of my time.
Awesome, very cool. So why don't we, so you both work at the food banks. I mean, obviously, you work with agencies that are offering these programs and services. So what does food insecurity mean? Why don't we talk about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's pretty hard to define, actually. Food insecurity is at the crossroads of a lot of things. And often I think of it as a symptom of a bigger problem. People are not food insecure because they don't know how to get food, or they usually people can't afford food. That's kind of the crux of it. So right. Hunger is a symptom of poverty, and so food insecurity, or people who are food insecure cannot access food securely. Right. So comfortably, culturally appropriate food. Right. In a dignified manner. They're not having to choose between their food and their rent. Right. So that's kind of our definition of food security or food insecurity. But there are others. There's a movement around health and food. So food security sometimes can look like gardens, community gardens, and right. community kitchens, right. Nutrition programs. There's a lot of different groups doing a lot of different things with food right. and interactions with food. I think for us, because we work at a place that we see a lot of people who don't have access to food, that tends to be what it is. But right. I think people's definition of food security can look like a lot of different things, like for migrant sure. labor. For sure. Or why is organic food so expensive?
Right.
But
Right.
the certification for organic food is so expensive. It can look a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and I guess depending on the community, it could also be like, like what they define as like the food deserts, right? Like just inaccessible locations where like, getting something from a fast food joint is cheaper than going and getting actual regular produce, right? From a grocery store.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess the type of food access, so people living in the north may not have as much access to fresh produce as those who are living in the south. And it's such a big topic, I guess. There's so many different avenues that you can take with that. But ours is pretty, kind of precise with regards to people who living in Toronto who can't access food and what surrounds their ability to get or not get food. Yeah.
Sure, and I mean, I think, given that we're talking about Toronto, I think, across Canada as well, there's lots of communities where this is still a challenge and a concern. So, but let's talk about Toronto since we're here, and we'll focus on that a bit.
Yeah.
So, what are the statistics? Like how prevalent is this issue? How can you give us some idea about that?
Yeah, we often don't. I feel like we don't have, as the public, we don't have an idea of the magnitude and the severity of hunger in Toronto, and hunger, poverty. Again, people making those really hard decisions between feeding their kids, feeding themselves, and so the numbers are a little bit hard to come by. But we use numbers of people coming to food banks and using our services. Those numbers are high. We saw more than 900,000 visits last year in Toronto. So, and there's a lot of research out there talking about how the majority of people who need food don't even come to food banks because there's so much stigma around it, or for a variety of reasons. So, the statistics I think that we have are even just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
But yeah, we see communities disproportionately affected by hunger as well. The Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy isolates a couple of community groups.
Right.
So they look at racialized people, so people of color, Indigenous people, Black people, people with disabilities, single mothers.
Right.
LGBT people, particularly trans people, because their median income is so low.
Right.
They're food insecure, and Indigenous and Aboriginal communities
Right.
in Toronto. 36% of Aboriginal people in Toronto live in poverty. Like the numbers are pretty staggering when you look at who is dealing with hunger and living in poverty.
For sure.
And we've seen a lot of growth in the suburbs. So the core, we saw a decrease in the core of 25% of food bank usage, and an increase of 86% in Scarborough and 170% in Etobicoke since the recession in 2008.
Right.
So we can see that poverty and hunger are moving outside of the core
Right.
and into the suburbs.
Into the suburbs, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good. So now we're talking about what kind. Can you give us an idea of why would somebody deal with? You talked about poverty. Like, what are the, and the fact that people's incomes are low. What are can you give us some examples of cases or stories that we could kind of talk about that might be helpful for people to understand what this actually looks like?
There's so many. There's so many because everybody's lives are so different, right? And so we could talk about rent, because we know rent is just so expensive in this city. And I know myself looking for a place to live. It's like, wow, it's pretty different since 10 years ago. So we know that there's people who are living in living rooms, and that there are ads for people to rent out living rooms. And we know families where a family might be working in the evenings or doing overnights, but they rent out their homes so that people who are, need to sleep during the day, and that, they're sleeping in shifts, and, or multi-families living in a two-bedroom apartment because the rent is just so high.
Right.
And those people who are able to have their own homes for their own families are doing whatever they can to be able to pay that rent. So whether it's, I'm going to pay my rent and I'm not going to purchase food this week, and they're coming to the food bank, or they're saying, okay, I'm going to pay my rent, or or I'm going to pay the extra school fees, right? So their kids can go on the school trips or participate in the scholastic book fairs and all these kinds of things, which means, you know, monies are going to these other places and not to food. Food tends to be one of those things where it's like, you know what, I can figure this out, or I can deal without. And everything else just takes a precedence, right? So that's like one area, and then you have the other area where people are going through mental health, a lot of stress. You know, there's a lot of job loss happening. There's a lot of people saying, well, you know, multitasking, so we're just going to make you do more work and not pay you, or, you know, a lot of part-time jobs, not a lot of like stability with that full-time with benefits. So people are working a variety of different jobs and still finding that they can't afford to pay their rent, or they can't afford to you know, maintain their transportation to get to their job, like all of these things that are stressing people out. And the one area where they can say, you know what, I can do without, because at least I know that there's a food bank down the street, or hopefully they know there's a food bank down the street, and that can help alleviate some of that stress. But we're living in some very, very stressful times right now, right? And people are doing the best that they can to make do.
For sure.
And we're seeing huge growth with seniors populations.
I
think over 60% of the people that we see are identified as having a disability. 25% of food bank users have a post-secondary degree. So you know, education is not a guarantee.
No, exactly. We're just going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back. Okay, we'll be back right after this. Hi everyone, welcome back to the AZEEZA show, and we're just talking about food insecurity with our two guests here. So, Irina, before the break, you were talking about the fact that 60% of those individuals that come to the food bank that we see are persons with disabilities. So, you know, what else do we sort of see in the food banks?
We see newcomers, people who are new to Canada. They might not stay for very long or use the services for very long, but certainly that leg up helps people. We see, as I said earlier, Indigenous, Aboriginal folks. They make up 10% of the people that we see, but only 0.5 of the population, so they're hugely overrepresented in poverty. I think with newcomers, we're seeing people come into the downtown core and then leave, and so the numbers spread into the suburbs. Sometimes people don't understand or know how to navigate the systems that we have in place to help people as well, like the OW system or the ODSP disability system. So having just, you know, places that within food banks that people can go and say, what is this? Or, you know, I need furniture. There's places where you can get free glasses, furniture, mattresses. That can really, you don't have to spend that money.
Which is great.
And then you can buy food,
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does a food bank look like? Maybe we can give our audience an idea of like, what does it feel like to go into a food bank, and how do people access food?
Oh, there's so many different spaces, right? Because many of the member agencies that run programs, it comes from their will, and the space is sort of like, let's see what we can do from whatever space that we have. So we can have food banks running out of like very, very tiny little rooms where they're handing out food through a window or something like that, to a large church basement where they might have had a gym or some sort of community space, and they could have tables set up in the center where people are eating, you know, cooked food and sitting down and talking and socializing, and around the outside is where they're collecting their food to be able to go home. We have multi-service agencies where when you're coming in to picking up your food, you're having access to other services, so dental services or housing services or other kinds of medical services, or just someone to talk to. So like the spaces that we support, they're so varied. What we try to do at Daily Bread is just ensure as much as possible that people, when people walk in, that they receive respectful and dignified service, that they're, you know, just respected and thanked and welcomed into the space, and it's understood that we, you know, kind of like in solidarity, right? We understand, we're going to do our best to help and break down any barriers for people feeling uncomfortable coming in the space. Just say, come in, the food is here. This is one thing off of your stressful plate that we can take, right?
Yeah, for sure. And is the food, you know, do you find that the food's accessible to different community groups? And like, what does that look like? Also, like, I know at Daily Bread we have like a number of, like there's a farm to table type program too, which is quite exciting. I had a chance to go on one of the trucks to the farms to see how that came, you know, and how the stuff got back. So that's kind of interesting. So what do you think?
We try to have low, as Nikki said, low barrier programs.
Right.
So we don't do any kind of means testing or proof of address or income, or you know, there's no qualifiers. There's no, people often think, well, am I poor enough to come, or all of that. Like there's no qualifiers. If you need food and you know whether you need it or not, you come. And we have best practices that try to open up food banks to the people who don't use them. And a lot of times that is like our communities of color, where there's a lot of stigma around it. I know for my family that would have been a really, really hard thing to do and to talk about.
For sure.
Having translation, really simple things that anybody can do at any kind of program, having translation and signage and talking openly about how food is a human right. It's not, we facilitate your right to food. You know, when 40% of our food goes into the garbage that we produce in Canada and North America. So, you know, it's not, there's no scarcity of food in Canada. It's that it's not going into people's hands, or they're not earning enough money to buy it. And so, so we look at looking at specific needs of communities. All the meat that we purchase is halal, which is why it's great to donate money, because then we can actually buy culturally appropriate food, and like rice instead of pasta or mac and cheese and things like that.
And I mean, and then we'd also be open to like getting donations from like ethno-specific, like you know, companies too, right? You could give flour and rice and stuff like that.
Anything that any time people get involved in their own communities means that the service becomes more relevant to that community. You know, so if South Asian people went into a food bank and made decisions for that program, then it would then be much more relevant. The service would cater to South Indian communities, just like when men make decisions about women's bodies and rights. And it's difficult for them to understand that perspective. That it's so when you see clients serving clients, as we call them, or people who use the services, helping each other, or communities coming together and running programs, then you start to get better service. Yeah,
for sure. And I know that I'd gone to one of the food banks in Scarborough, and I think we saw each other there. So I had there it was different, right? It was like some of the residents of the community who were also accessing the service were volunteering their time.
Oh yes,
right.
The majority of them, the majority of them lived in the community or were part of the community, and were also accessing food from the food program, and also volunteers. So it's a great program because you have that involvement. The people know. There's more interaction with people because they know each other. So it's sort of like, okay, I know what this person's situation is. I know the different kinds of food that they may or may not need, or even to the point whereas I know this family is really ill, they can't make it here right now. So we're just going to make sure that they get that food. And so it's it really does build quite a bit of community there. So
I remember growing up, we, like our family, we went through some difficult times as well. We grew up in subsidized housing. We had a large family, a number of younger siblings and stuff. And like my parents would not go to the food bank. That wasn't even a question, right? Like we would rather eat rice and lentils and what we call dal or whatever for long periods of time, but not access it. And I remember starting working much younger, like 16. I ended up leaving school and just started working to help like make ends meet and stuff. But the breakfast club was something that I remember going to, because at least the kids then could have their breakfast, right? And then we would volunteer our time, and in exchange, like all the kids would have their breakfast, and then we'd go home and everything would be fine, right? In some cases, they would give us like a snack or whatever to take to school too. So that was kind of nice. So it's like those are the kinds of things that I think sometimes we forget about, right? It's like what is it like, and that's the reason why I do the work that I do, right? It's
Mm.
partly part of my lived experience. It's like I don't want people to have to count money out of a jar and start to think about, okay, that's all I have to go and buy a bag of milk, right? Like,
Right.
because I've been there, you know, it's
Yeah,
just, it's
yeah,
terrible,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So what inspires you both to be like, you know, working in this area or this sector, you know, why is this important to you?
I think for me, like similarly, I came here as a well, a 9-year-old, I guess, and yeah, we were immigrants, and we also struggled for many years to make ends meet.
Right.
And I think as a queer person too, and a person of color, it's those communities kind of coming together for me. Like, you know, food banks are, I think people think of people who use food banks as a certain kind of person. They're not. They're every kind of person.
Yeah,
They're,
exactly.
you know, they're people that look like us. They're people who lived like us and maybe had a mental health problem, or that hunger can and poverty can strike anybody. And I think, yeah, I think I felt close to the issue. And I think it's healing in a way to like, to, you know, help people that we know what they're feeling, we can understand deeply what their experience is.
Awesome.
I hear you there. I think mine a little different because there were just a lot of tensions happening in my home environment. So I left my home environment at an early age, so I was at 17. I was, you know, in and out of shelters and definitely access food programs, you know, when I had to, so living on the street here and there. But just getting to know the people who are accessing along with me. When I say that there is a sense of community there, there is a sense of community there,
For
right?
sure.
You meet the same people every week, and you get to know the people who are providing the services, and it really helped me a lot to be able to access food from a food bank. So coming to work at Daily Bread, it was also, you know, a form of giving back.
For
And
sure.
you know, it just, those kinds of experiences never leave you. And I find that whenever I speak to people who have found their way and into some form of a more stable life, or even those that haven't, they really just want to give back, you know, or they identify, they want to help, they want to be a part of this experience. And so, yeah, that was my way back here.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for what you do. It's amazing.
That's right.
Thanks.
So, question: what can somebody do if they're looking to, like, if they're food insecure? What advice would you give?
It's tough, like that, you know, food insecure is often, again, people living in poverty, and so they're trying to make ends meet, they're trying to survive. Often, you know, we see people working multiple jobs, single parents. So it's hard to recommend things for them to do. There are supports available, and a lot of places can provide help in navigating those supports. So I would encourage people to go seek that, but they probably already do. You know, people will do what they need to do to survive. But I think it's more for everybody else. As you said, we could normalize things like this. Everyone needs a helping hand. We could donate to programs like this.
Sure.
Every dollar turns into $5 in our hands.
Yeah, that's
You know,
wonderful.
that's
Can we
huge.
talk a little bit about that? Like how far the impact goes, right? Like, and what can people do in the community? We've only got a few minutes left, so what do you recommend people do in the community?
Yeah, I mean, definitely with regards to, you know, making that donation to Daily Bread, dollars go way further, right? Outside of doing that sort of direct donation piece of it, I mean, get to know how your community, you know, works, not just your own sort of bubble in your community. We do tend to live in a lot of bubbles, and we don't see the people who are really struggling. So what's going on for them, right? What can you do to try and help make their lives a little bit easier? And therefore, you're doing some great work there too.
Excellent.
And speak with them, stand with people
Right.
in your community, use the power and privilege that we have to speak, you know, for the rights of people that don't have the time to speak or the
sure.
voice. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for being on the show, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so until next week, looking forward to speaking to you about another topic that impacts us, but for now, let's just remember that food insecurity is a lot closer to home than we think. Take care.